So the day is almost at a close, sadly. We have one more speaker today, and that's Scott Hames. And I'm very excited about this, partially because I think having these two presentations back to back will be fascinating. The questions of how we archive a campaign that people were recognizing as an important moment as it was happening, but it was also quite hectic and fast-paced. As was suggested by others, folks were often doing things on a voluntary basis, and archival was not the first priority. So it's a very, very interesting thing about how do we archive that. And I think Scott will be speaking in part to the sense of urgency around capturing materials while also being activists, I think in part. I might be completely misrepresenting his talk, but let's hope not. So Scott Hames is a lecturer in English at the University of Stirling, where he chairs the Stirling Centre for Scottish Studies. He was a keen student of the referendum debate and has published widely on contemporary Scottish writing and literary nationalism, including articles on James Kelman, Alistair Gray, Urban Welsh, Alan Warner, Don Paterson, and the cultural politics of Scotland vernacularity. He edited the Edinburgh Companion to James Kelman, Unstated, Writers on Scottish Independence, which we're selling copies of at the back, and the International Journal of Scottish Literature with Eleanor Bell and Ian Duncan. Reviews and commentary have also appeared in Hard Times, Open Democracy, and the London Review of Books. A retrospective on the new Scottish Renaissance will shortly appear in the Oxford History of the Novel in English, and he is currently completing a monograph on Scottish literature and the politics of independence 1979 through 2014, partly based on the findings of a 2-year research project on narrating Scottish devolution funded by the British Academy. And a further book project on James Kelman is in preparation, so please join me in welcoming Scott Hames.
Well, thanks very much. And before I say anything, I think I want to, first of all, thank the organizers, Sarah and Katie, not only for inviting me and making this all possible, but for having the idea and realizing it. So I'm sure all the speakers and attendees would like to thank you for making this happen. Okay, it's, yes, as Katie hinted, I've been interested and preoccupied with how we're going to historicize this process for quite a while, and today's been really fascinating and interesting from that point of view. I'm going to talk quite a bit about nostalgia, but not simply a kind of sentimental longing for a year ago or the process that preceded that. I'm going to look more at the narrative problems thrown up by the question of how we make sense of all the material we might want to archive and document. And so my title there is Indie Ref Nostalgia and the Sense of an Ending, or Not Too Long From Now, Tonight Will Be That Last Time. I'll come on to that a bit later. But I need to start by citing the most indispensable and authoritative guide to current affairs in the UK. That is, of course, the Daily Mash. And this is the way that satirical website marked the anniversary of the referendum. Scotland celebrates an anniversary of nothing happening. Scotland is today celebrating 1 year since absolutely nothing happened and everything stayed exactly the same. Of course, that's a joke and not to be taken too seriously, but there actually is a genuine narrative problem contained in that proposition. Of course, the no vote and the outcome of the referendum wasn't a nothing. The cancellation of a historic rupture is an historic event itself. And if we view it positively or even just honestly, it's very easy to see that the no vote was the first democratic legitimation of the Union, and a fairly handsome one. No other proposition in Scottish history has garnered 2 million votes. But it might feel like a nothing because of the special difficulty of locating that event and its somethingness within some kind of teleology commensurate with its significance. It's quite a heavy way to start this, so let me try and explain what I mean by that. The no vote taken on its own terms is self-evidently a major historical moment, but it's very difficult to narrativize that moment as the crowning fulfillment of the forces which preceded it and which made it both possible and necessary. The ultimate ends and purpose of the Union, I will suggest, were not condensed into a singular moment of radiant affirmation. In fact, the pro-UK campaign had very little to say about Britishness or unionism as a living ideology. On the other side of the debate, it would have been quite straightforward to present a yes result in those sort of vaulting teleological terms. Indeed, the speeches had already been written. But partly because of the ambivalence of the no result, it's much less easy to make narrative sense of what actually happened. Scotland acceding to a continuation of the constitutional status quo does not lend itself to the higher registers of historical imagination. And in that respect, you might say that formally endorsing the Union feels, in narrative terms, no more dramatic than extending your mortgage. In that respect, the Indie Ref represented a profoundly skewed narrative choice. There were two possible outcomes, two possible ends of the story, but only one of those possibilities was truly eligible to operate as an end with a capital E, a telos, around which we might derive a purposive trajectory that we could then use to order our sense of purpose and logic in arranging history around that center. And here I need to divert into literary criticism. Almost 50 years ago, the great English critic Frank Kermode wrote of our deep need for intelligible ends, ends with a capital E. Humankind finding itself in the middle of things whose purpose and totality we cannot grasp, we have to resort to narrative. And, says Kermode, we use fictions to enable the end, to confer organization and form on the temporal structure. In a moment, I'm going to explore a few recent Scottish fictions which twist and stretch the temporal organization of political hope and political nostalgia, very often with a nod to the inevitability of political disappointment. It's the provision of that end, that telos, which activates the narrative grammar of purpose, consequence, and development. And it may be that only one of the two possible answers to the Scottish question furnishes us with such a shining end. What is more, and what's my focus here, only one of the possible outcomes holds out the promise of a future retrospect. Only one of those possibilities allows us to project ourselves into a moment past the end in which we can look back and understand what led to it. In the absence of the outcome best equipped to fulfill that task, we are in difficulties. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that only the achievement of independence can make Scotland's recent political history intelligible, and that unless and until Scotland votes yes, the story of its political doings and happenings will be devoid of purpose and coherence. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that only one of the two constitutional options is accompanied, and to some extent powered, by a clear narrative teleology, in which it's possible to anticipate a satisfactory end that fulfills, redeems, and justifies what came before. Unless we imagine it as some kind of operatic final reckoning, the affirmation and continuance of the Union is really only narratable as the extension of a middle. And in this sense, the unsettled character of the Scottish question is not only a matter of political consensus, but of narrative dynamics. Thinking of such matters, I was preoccupied from an early stage with the imminently historic quality of the Indie Ref, the palpable sense of something pivotal and exceptionally significant unfolding day by day. And Amy just reviewed some of the events that led to that sense. Without the clear sense of an ending which confers narrative meaning on the succession of events, it's very difficult to organize that. And as the campaigns kicked into gear, I was enormously struck by one phenomenon in particular, that being the auto-archival impulse, which seemed to accompany much of the discussion and activism. That is to say, activity which was about recording and documenting your own, in-the-moment discussion and debate live. And of course, the inevitable image for that is the National Collective sign. I took the chance to photograph as its own separate portrait this very busy sign when it wasn't, for once, being held up in front of other people taking selfies with it. I think it was on a coffee break at one of the festival events, and it deserved its own portrait in its own right, because it was a really key signifier within the debate. Andrew Tickell commented on all the self-archiving activity that was happening in an article about National Collective and called it archive fever. I've been trying to make sense of that archive fever, as I think Amy has, for some time. Perhaps we were responding to what Kermode calls kairos, the pregnant season of anticipation, filled with significance, charged with meaning derived from its relation to the end. In other words, maybe in the anticipation of some kind of culminating end to a political process, arguably the end of the Union, possibly the end of the debate, there's a kind of special gathering intensity to the political meaning of day-to-day actions. And perhaps we were struggling to make that sense of importance concrete and collectible through all that archival activity. But it seems to me impossible to recover in the preterite frame, that is to say from today's retrospect, that living impulse to archive the IndieRef live, that is, at the time, and before the moment had concluded or released its meanings. Perhaps we were getting our nostalgia in early, and that preemptive memorialization is very difficult to retrieve or re-inhabit now, which makes the historical self-consciousness of the IndieRef curiously impossible to historicize. Or at least impossible to historicize in ways that rely strictly on evidence and material traces. To get a handle on the strange mood of anticipation and the intense nowness and contingency of last summer, I think we need to return to narrative imagination. Luckily, we have some helpful forebears in Scottish writing who cast a useful light on the struggle to narrativize the sense of possibility and voided possibility that I, for one, was feeling last September. Grieving that sense of lapsed or thwarted potential, for those of us who voted yes, was something that turned out to be far more painful than I would have expected. And I'm curious at how people perform the work of mourning, as Freud would call it, in processing and disinvesting themselves from that loss. One part of the problem, perhaps, was being ill-prepared for the narrative trouble manifested by the no result. That is, for those of us inhabiting a yes mentality. And what that shift meant was sudden banishment from the season of kairos, pregnancy and possibility, a sense of time that is in active affirmation of the next moment, of the concluding moment, of the end, which confers purpose on the time you spend waiting, and being shoved into some other temporal space, being shoved into the other alternative, which Kermode calls chronos, the meaningless interval of mere passing time or waiting time, not bounded by the anticipation of an end. So Keynote has an amazing explanation of this if you think of the sound of a clock mix. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. So the space between the tick and the talk is charged with significance because you're anticipating the end. Talk concludes the pattern, and between tick and talk, you're in the season of kairos and waiting for something to happen. But there's a second interval there which you don't really process as an interval, which is the gap between the concluding talk and the initial tick of the next instance. And that's just empty time. That's just chronos. That is kind of empty duration in which we need to learn how best to wait. And I was very struck by that phrase in Robert's paper this morning. Being thrust into a different temporal space where waiting is part of the political consciousness in a different way. I think literature can help us navigate that interval, and not least that minor strand of recent Scottish writing which explores the ends of independence. So I have a few examples. The most inevitable and important is probably Edward Morgan's The Coin, published in Sonnets from Scotland in 1984. I'll read this quickly, although I'm losing my voice here. A very well-known poem, which appeared, not to labor my trope, very much at the end and the conclusive, meaning-conferring moment of Morgan's own life on the order of service at his funeral. We brushed the dirt off, held it to the light. The obverse showed us Scotland and the head of a red deer. The antler glint had fled, but the fine cuts could still be felt. All right, we turned it over, read easily, £1. Take that, Osborne. But then the shock of Latin, like a gloss, res publica Scotorum, sent across such ages as we guessed, but never found, at the worn edge where once the date had been, and where as many fingers had gripped hard, as hopes their silent race had lost or gained. The marshy scurf crept up to our machine, sucked at our boots, yet nothing seemed ill-starred, and least of all the realm the coin contained. What I want to focus on briefly here is that what I think this poem is about is not the artifact, the coin, which harkens back to some reality, the achievement of the Scottish Republic. I think what this poem is really about is how you narrate the recovery of that fact. That is to say, how some unachieved condition, which has now elapsed and is now historical, can be made narrative sense of, and what kind of purposive story we can embed that coin in. Because the coin doesn't mean anything on its own. No artifact does. It has to be embedded in narrative. So we're invited to view this excavation against the vague horizon of an end with a capital E, far beyond that of independence itself. These visiting aliens, as they seem to be, challenge us to narrativize the achievement of the Scottish Republic, issuing its own pound coins, within some larger and more diffuse historical frame in which these alien visitors are arriving at what appears to be a post-Scotland. Seemingly, the coin is an artifact of the Scotland yet to be, which has already been put to an end. And the artifact on its own will only take us so far in making sense of what its origins mean for us much later. We have a similar kind of stretching of time and imagining of future independence in a story of Janice Galloway's called Tourists from the South Arrive in the Independent State. This was published in '96, and in it we encounter a new Scotland through the eyes of some very patient and curious outsiders, presumably English, who tactfully note the strangeness of this new state, but also its familiarity. This is a long quote, and the image will just pick up the second half of it. So it's a touring party who have come to visit this new country, which is newly independent. They touched down 4 hours late and the luggage hadn't arrived, but they didn't mind. These things happened. Even in the most sophisticated of places, these things happened. They spent the time they might otherwise have spent minding in a cluster at the carousel, willing it to start, nodding to clusters of islanders left over from internal flights, trying not to stare over much, the sight of decent wool knitted into such awful jerseys. They chose instead to listen, feeding their ears on those thick, near-Slavic vowels, now and again, an almost familiar word crunching with consonants. There was a distinct Eastern Bloc snugness of pronunciation when you attended carefully. Really, something less harsh than one had been led to believe. And that establishes the tone of the whole story, which is strongly reminiscent of Eastern Bloc travelogues by idealistic Westerners in the 80s, sniffing gamely at the stale cabbage exoticism of Kiev or Bucharest. The emphasis falls on a kind of worthy Guardian-reading resistance to stereotypes and judgment. Judgment about dirt, about rudeness, about backwardness, and the touring party's very keen willingness to make allowances and avoid giving offense. Scotland is now properly foreign, and the touring party rather relish the chance to start afresh. They do so with maximum tact and consideration. But the locals are surly, you might say still surly, indifferent to the solicitude of the southern visitors. The dynamic has altered between these former co-nationalists, until recently citizens of the same state. Odd that their countries being formerly separate now should make them feel so much closer, so much more tolerant. Smiles were the least they could do to salute the fact. The islanders weren't looking. They had huddled together, lighting a single cigarette and passing it on. They did not smile back. They didn't even notice, and that was perfectly all right too. Of course it was. gauche to force contact in any case, patronizing. They were a people whose history had led them to be wary, and rightly so, rightly so. The gruffness of the natives is now justified by their underdog past, a sense of victimhood both affirmed and overcome in the achievement of independence. The grubby stain of this past lies on the new Scotland like a fresh coat of paint. For the independent state is anything but new and gleaming. It's a shabby, rack-rent world of gap sites and graffiti, thinning carpets and graceless staff. From the moment we leave Glasgow Airport, the air is ripe with, quote, faulty incinerators and fish suppers, a faint undertone of malt. Independence, it would seem, has been a giant step backward. The future is meaner and older than the present, tarnished and worn out. The visiting outsiders had dared to hope for something else, and can only resist their disappointment up to a point. 15 floors high in the new Independence Hotel, quote, glimmers of admission that things were not all they had hoped for were undeniable. As they reach the end of their journeys, having navigated the rude hotel receptionist and eventually finding their rooms, there's only one hope to cling to as they struggle to open the creaking doors of their hotel rooms. Yet behind the closed eyelids, they hoped for better things. Perhaps the door would surrender next try. The room that opened before them might be cheerful, modest, and clean. They would walk inside, close the old day out, leave luggage where it fell, and tumble onto the freshly turned sheets. The Kelman novels they had brought for atmosphere would wait or be used, spines cracked open, to place over weary faces to keep out the morning light. When it came, and it would certainly come. Morning always did. So here's the pathos of the cancelled future, dying as we confront the ragged reality. But it's not the factual reality of the independent state which proves so disenchanting. It is the incremental thwarting of the narrative arc, the denial of the happy ending, of the green shoots, of the fresh start. It is the erasure of the imagined divergence from Kelman world, which would redeem the pain and inconvenience of separation. The tourists are reaching, quite literally, after a destination which can justify the experience of the journey. They're reaching after an end, a telos that will organize and make meaningful that experience. And perhaps also the experience of Scotland. Again and again, they extend the possibility of an end which will order and recover what they have endured so far. Naturally, I'm interested in the choice of reading material here. The tourists bring Kelman novels for atmosphere, but I'm not sure I know whether to laugh. Atmosphere of what? Books evoking the old Scotland in all its grit and squalor, a dead world now superseded by the independent state, a world rendered quaint and historical by the promise of the new. Whatever these Kelman novels are meant to tokenize, they make a particularly interesting choice within this thought experiment. Because, of course, Kelman's fiction is forearmed against being embedded in the national story in quite this way. That is to say, being rendered up as nationally representative or plotted against watershed public events. In Kelman's fiction, as Lawrence Nichol reminds us, events become irreducible moments which fail to cohere around a consistent, progressive plot. Kelman's fiction is about trying to dramatize and inhabit that momenthood in all its contingency from its inner edge, both in their internal organization and in their external anchorage in really existing Scotland. Kelman's stories refuse to explain or be explained within the determining trajectory of a national before and after. Far more common in Kelman's fiction is the pattern of thought or anticipation that I've borrowed in my subtitle, which is the title of a Kelman story. Not too long from now, tonight will be that last time. A title that looks forward to that moment in the near future in which we can narrativize the now, in which the present moment and its living contingency will be safely assimilated to the ordered past. The deadening incorporation, you might say, of the living moment into a prosaic sequence of last times. That seems to be the price of integrating temporal experience and conferring meaning upon it. One of the few avenues of escape permitted to Kelman's characters, one that relieves their grinding immersion in the living moment, are fantasies of the future past. That is to say, fantasies of the past available to us from remote into the future, how we might look back from somewhere distant ahead of us. A breakthrough story in Kelman's early career is Not While the Gyro, published in 1983, in which the main character imagines escaping a living death of poverty and beggary. All that keeps him from suicide is the realization that his gyro is due in 2 days, by imagining his future vocation as the Scottish Coast Road walker. This new life of freedom, spent ambling around the coastline of Scotland on a voyage without beginning or end and without any purpose other than to continue walking. The kinds of freedom offered by this fantasy have to do with a kind of existential dislocation, the impossibility of pinning him down within the orders of space or narrative. As he really builds up a head of steam imagining this fantasy, this is the sort of imagery he comes up with. I don't have to restrict myself to mapped routes from which the slightest deviation is frowned upon. On the contrary, that last-minute decision at the country crossroads can only enhance the affair. And after a few return trips, being a circular route, no such thing as a return would exist, i.e. I would be traveling on an arc, the farm folk and country dwellers would know me well, the good wives leaving thick winter woolies by the side of the road, flasks of oxtail soup under hedges, shepherds offering shelter in remote bothies by the blazing log fires, sipping hot toddies for the wildest nights, and plenty of tobaccos, always the one essential luxury. And the children up and down the land crying, "Mummy, here comes the Scottish Coast Road walker," while I would dispense the homespun philosophies of the day. Homespun philosophies of the daisy growing and the planet as it revolves, etc. Here is another post facto fantasy of independence, personal rather than national. The momentum here is to escape the requirements of story and propulsive action, and to make of his life pure legend. Thus the comic shift into a romantic idiom evoking Kailyard in the world of Hogg, the fantastical projection of the future self into a space of nostalgic yearning, rendered ironic in advance. That story evokes many of the questions on my mind as the referendum came into focus, and I began to wonder, chiefly as a literary historian, how the living momenthood of the independence debate would come to be narrativized, both by scholars and by politicians. There's two projects I'll mention very briefly. The second of them was the conference represented on the bottom there, which was called If Scotland, Posting 2014. And the premise of this was to ask people to imagine that it wasn't a few weeks before the vote, but rather a few decades after the vote, and how they would make sense of the new Scotland or the old Scotland that the vote had produced. So we considered both yes and no possibilities, trying to project the liquid sense of possibility of last summer into a future retrospect, several decades into the ends represented either by a yes vote or a no vote, after all that possibility and contingency had hardened into textbook certainties. And the proceedings of that will be out shortly in the Journal of Scottish Thought, which includes a completely unique essay by Robert Crawford, in which you can learn all about his unique pronunciation of Foucault. The other book project was unstated, and the purpose of that was fairly straightforward. Quoting the introduction to it, the idea for this book assumes that prominent Scottish writers will feature in the rhetoric of both official campaigns, but also that their views will be managed, storied, inflated, and filtered in various distorting ways, that is to say, to suit the agenda of political campaigns. I gained no pleasure at all in being proved right about that, even before the book was published. On the evening of the book launch party, Alistair Gray's essay in this book and its supposed bigotry was being debated on television. As I said earlier, that's a whole other story. And I don't want to really get into the morass of political bias and the spinning of what people have really said or what factual reality really amounts to. Far more interesting, I think, is to notice that what I'm fretting about here, politicians commandeering writers to serve their own political agendas, fitting them into their own preconceived arguments and telos, is only a slightly crasser version of what literary critics do all the time. Notably, in the arid and circular debates about identity which tend to dominate Scottish literary studies. And, to quote Alex Thompson, the allegorical mining of texts to explain the nation and be explained by the nation. My very mild polemical point on this is to observe that the relationship between Scottish literature and Scottish politics can only be fitted to those teleologies by distorting both the literature and the politics, or falsely presenting them as the same thing somehow. And I think we have a few clear examples of this during the referendum debate. Ian McWhirter observes that the referendum, quote, was the first time I can recall in Britain where artists and writers really were in the forefront of a political movement and not just ornaments to it. I agree with him up to a point, but again, that's another one for the pub. But that's not a striking observation to make. That is, in fact, the preferred self-image of Scottish literary studies. It has been for several decades. With a nod to 1979, the poet and critic Christopher White noted back in 1998 that, quote, in the absence of elected political authority, the task of representing the nation has been repeatedly devolved to its writers. And the view is so commonplace today, it has been internalized by many distinguished writers, including Alan Warner. Now, a few weeks before the vote, Warner predicted that a no vote will create a profound and strange schism between the voters of Scotland and its literature, a new convulsion. It will be the death knell for the whole Scottish literature project, a crushing denial of an identity that writers have been meticulously accumulating, trying to maintain and refine. I think there's a whole number of sort of mental mistakes and category errors in the background of this, but for a moment, let me take it literally. And if we do take it literally, the project of Scottish literature is now redundant, or at the very least, struggling to find new justifications. The social mission of Scottish literature, to adapt the title of the book on English, is perhaps available for critique and contestation as never before, and I think Ariana was pointing in this direction earlier. I find that opportunity quite energizing, although there's also many signs of closure. But it's not my focus as I conclude. Let me conclude by observing how strange it is to find Alan Warner, of all writers, talking earnestly about historical oblivion and finality. His own fiction, I would suggest, stands passionately against all that, being charged with a deep yearning, and very often an erotic yearning, to re-inhabit the past, to repeat and relish the world of memory, often rendered mythical and shadowed by the certainty of death, of an end. Drowning at sea is only a minor narrative problem if your central character has the return ticket of myth, as Morven Caller has at the start of These Demented Lands. Likewise, in Warner's novel The Man Who Walks, the gory beds of historic battle are available both for Hollywood spectacle and something much stranger and more intense, a kind of second-order mythologization so surreal and bizarre as to rig up some living, pungent reality from the assembled props. At the end of that book, the nephew's wild and often purposeless journeying reaches its end with a capital E at a virtual Culloden. He got some vantage on the fields around him. He managed to push himself up on his arms like a press-up, and sure enough, the grassland and rougher moor around him was thickly littered with these mannequins in Highland dress, scattered weaponry, and even an entire fake horse corpse, its stuffing thrust out of the torn stitching across its belly. And there, sure enough in the distance, the deep burn of high-fired movie lights, flanked by battalions of reflectors, were blasting down on reality, fighting the natural light with overwhelming, colonizing superiority, determined to force a vision on the mundane and curse the consequences. And that last image comes close to my abiding memory of the indie ref, and what I mean about its historical self-consciousness. The high-fired lights of a projected retrospect, looking back at us from an unknown future, explaining and judging us, extracting our meaning and consequence within a teleology organized around ends invisible to us, groping around at ground level. Let me finish by trying to connect this to our current political moment and the striking conservatism of radical political imagining in 2015. Andrew Tickell has a piece in The Current Druth noting the oddness of the MP's youngest MP, Mary Black, evoking Tony Benn as her political hero, and the rhetoric of betrayal which accompanies so much of the SNP surge. Pointing out that Mary Black was born several months after Tony Blair became Labour leader, Tickell asks, quote, Which Labour Party was it which left Mary Black? Was it Jim Callaghan's compromises in office between 1976 and 79 which put her off? The expulsion of militant in the 80s? The Healy-Benn deputy leadership conflict in 1981? And so on. I can only parse that mobilizing grievance of Black's generation, the Labour left me tendency, as a claim to a political heritage, a paradigm of thwarted hope borrowed from their parents and grandparents. As Tickell writes, and the brave New Scotland voted into existence on the 7th of May, quote, the past and its identities continue to cast a long shadow. Even Scotland's newest SNP MP in the salad days of youth thinks historically, looking backwards, appealing backwards to a placeless, timeless authenticity which Scottish Labour is alleged to have betrayed. I'm going to suggest that Black's inherited disappointment, this heritage of loss, is something like the Kelman novels toted along to the New Independence Hotel, or the permanent past evoked by the rustic charm of the Scottish Coast Road walker, suspended on his arc, moving ceaselessly through recursive loops which defeat ends in teleology. These are static images and static paradigms, projected not against possibility, not against an end which will justify the hard miles ahead, but of redemption and even vengeance, the countering of last time but the next time, without truly reckoning with the profound change in circumstance represented by the no result. I'm not sure Scotland in 2015 has shown itself willing or able to adjust its narrative grammar to incorporate that fact, or to look forward to a next time charged with potential and kairos of our own, rather than hearkening back to last time. The post facto fictions of independence I've been tracing here warn us against mistaking the destination for the end. Thanks.
You have questions? I'll stand there.
Why don't you talk more about poetry?
That's your department.
No, that's the conference topic.
True. You got me on one there. In that, I was conscious of this in rereading some of the Kermode stuff, because I'm obviously preoccupied with the narrative dynamics of all this, and that does seem to me politically significant in a way that the lyric impulse perhaps isn't. Although I think you're absolutely right to say that the Union has no songs, and the lack of a kind of abiding, not necessarily poetic, but aesthetic dimension to Britishness that gives it some kind of traction in the world of imagination is one of the key narrative problems that Unionists are now facing. But no, I didn't talk about poems.
Can I ask, when you put together Unstated, and just thinking back to the introduction to that, did the role of artists in the referendum do exactly what you thought, or were there quite a lot of surprises along the way? How did all of that change for you as you went along?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I had really clear notions about what would happen. What I'm trying to do in that introduction is just frame what might happen based on what has recently happened in the way that writers get tangled up in narrativizing political change, etc. As I mentioned, things like writers being manipulated, or their image being manipulated in sort of rhetorical ways, was easy enough to predict. Things that really surprised me, it's hard to say. I'm not fully convinced, as I mentioned, that writers and even artists more generally have the impact outside their own little world that we might wish to confer on them. I can't back that up. But I think it's hard to argue with any, as Robert mentioned this morning, it's hard to suggest that writers had a really substantive influence on changing anyone's mind about how to vote. So I don't think they were that central to the debate as a debate. But as a set of problems in making sense of Scottish culture and history, they were prominent. I don't know if there was many surprises though.
If there's no further questions, could you all join me in thanking Scott once more?